And here I thought choosing movies for top 5 lists was hard. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. So today I'm going to be doing a slightly different type of video from normal, because I have been tagged. You might have seen this genre tag challenge popping up on other channels you watch, because it's certainly spreading across FilmTube right now, and my time has come. So I'm going to be talking about my top films from 13 different genres. The basic idea here is that once you've been tagged by another YouTuber, you have to list your favorite film from a selection of different genres, and then tag 7 other YouTubers so that they can do the same thing. It's kind of a fun little community strengthening challenge where we not only get to talk about some of our favorite movies, but also support our fellow FilmTube creators and friends. I was tagged by the wonderful Luke Hearfield. He is so much fun. Definitely one of my favorite YouTubers. I love his channel, I love his videos, and I honestly don't know how he puts out so much content. He reviews festival films, new releases, older movies, TV shows. He talks about the award shows and predictions for those. He's so fun and engaging and funny, and he has a really awesome custom-built background for his videos. And he's just a great guy. He's not only one of my favorite movie YouTubers, but he's also been one of my friends basically since I first started on YouTube. I have a link to his channel and his genre tag video in the description below, so please go check him out and make sure you subscribe. So the 7 channels I'm tagging are Cineflect, Daisuke Beppu, Geekly Goods, Jacob Anders Reviews, J-Buck Studios, Elsie Screen Talk, and Steph Koza vs. the Movies. I have links in the description to all of these channels, so again, please go check them out and subscribe, because they're all awesome. Okay, let's talk about these genres. Apparently this tag started off as just 10 genres, the ones listed over here. But to make a slightly more comprehensive list, Luke added these 3 extra genres. So I'm gonna follow his lead and actually talk about 13 genres rather than just 10. But to the people I've tagged, you can feel free to only stick with the original 10 if you want. And obviously, you're under no obligation to make your own video, even if I tagged you. Totally optional, it's just a fun little tagging challenge. I love your videos, I'm interested in seeing what your picks would be, and I just want to support you, whether you want to make a video based on this tag or not. Alright, let's get into these genres. Science fiction. So I'm going in the order that Luke did his genres, and we're starting off with the one that I think is going to be representative of the difficulty that I had with choosing my top movies for most of these genres. I personally always have a really hard time when I have to pick my favorite or top movie for any sort of classification. And I think that's even more challenging when we're looking at genres, because so many movies, most movies, are more than just one thing and cross those genre boundaries. And so my pick for sci-fi is one of those types of movies. Inception. You could easily put this into probably 4 other genres, but this is just one of those fantastic high-concept sci-fi movies for me. I love this type of movie. I know other people might think of robots and aliens and space exploration when they think of sci-fi, and that's totally reasonable. But for me, it's always these mind-boggling, time-bending types of films that come out on top. And I love everything about this movie. The story and premise, the characters, the script, the performances, the cinematography, the score, the casting, all of it. It was my absolute favorite movie of last decade, and one of my all-time favorite movies, regardless of the time period. Animation. So I love animated films. Like most people, I imagine, I sorta got my start with animated films. I grew up during the Disney Renaissance era, during the time that Pixar was getting up and running, when DreamWorks was first starting to get into animation, when Don Bluth films were big. From an animation standpoint, it was the perfect time to be a kid, and as a result, I'm a huge animation fan. I love so many of these movies, but luckily for me, I do have a definitive top film. The Lion King. This was my first favorite movie. To say that I grew up with this film is an understatement. The Lion King was my childhood. It was the first movie that I ever saw in the theater, and after that, I was obsessed. Everything was Lion King for me. But even as I got older, this movie stuck with me, and I've been able to connect with it differently at different stages of my life. And it's just one of those very rare, perfect movies for me. The characters, the story, the themes, the emotion, the music, the animation, it's all amazing, and it's somehow both revolutionary and timeless at the same time. Drama. So I think this is easily the broadest film genre in existence. It seems like almost everything is at least partly a drama. I mean, according to Letterboxd, I've watched nearly 1,130 different dramas in the last 7 years alone. And so this is one of those genres that I honestly don't even really know how to go about picking my top one. I mean, I could give you 100 dramas that I love, but if I have to pick just one, I'll go with Catch Me If You Can. Of course, this is another movie that could fit into a bunch of different genres, but it's at least in large part a drama. It's another one of these movies that I just love no matter how many times I watch it. It's got some incredibly tough competition, but I would say that this is my favorite Steven Spielberg movie. It's just such an interesting and compelling story that spans a surprisingly large period of time. Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio give some amazing performances here, and I adore both the production design and the score of this film, and honestly, pretty much everything else about it too. Romance. So I'll admit that this would be a fairly difficult genre for me if it wasn't for the melding and crossover between genres. There are certainly a few that I enjoy, but it's rare for me to really love a true straight-up romance film. Instead, I like movies that blend romantic subplots with something else. Action, adventure, mystery, comedy, and so my top pick is actually a romantic comedy. And honestly, I think most people, including myself, would consider the primary genre of this one to be comedy rather than romance, but I'm putting it here just because my comedy genre already has an absolute lock-in for number one. So my top film is Coming to America. Again, I realize that this is first and foremost a comedy, but it's actually a really great romance too. I mean, the whole premise is that Akeem is coming to America to find a wife, or more accurately, to find a woman that he truly loves. And so there's some really great romance and romantic comedy stuff happening in this film in addition to the more commonly thought of comedy that's here. This is one of my all-time favorite movies, like one of my top 3 favorites, and it has been since I was pretty young. This is one of those movies that I could quote the entirety of the script, and one that just never gets old for me, no matter how many times I rewatch it. Action. Another one of our broadest genres. I'm somebody who really likes action movies, and so I think you'll find as we go through all of these genres that many of my top movies in the other genres are ones that could be considered action movies too. So some of my favorite action movies are already earmarked for some of these other categories just based on the additional genres they have. And so for the action category here, I wanted to pick a movie that was basically just pure action and didn't have a ton of other genres seeping in. So I chose Mission Impossible Fallout. This was such an incredibly enjoyable action film. I like the Mission Impossible franchise quite a bit, but I thought for sure that none of the further sequels would ever be able to top Ghost Protocol for me. And then we got Fallout. This movie has some impressively insane action sequences and stunts. Everything feels so real, 'cause it is. It's truly remarkable to know that not only was just about every single stunt accomplished practically, but that Tom Cruise did just about every one of those stunts himself. And it really pays off with some heart-pounding sequences. Skydiving, brutal fight scenes, motorcycle chases, rooftop foot chases, helicopters, and even some throwback rock climbing. Combine that with a genuinely solid story, and you've got one fantastic action movie. Comedy. So here we've got yet another incredibly broad genre, and one that's also very subjective. There are a lot of different types of humor, and so there are also a lot of types of comedy too. Then when you take into consideration the fact that comedy is one of those genres that's frequently combined with other genres, the choice possibilities become practically overwhelming. Most of my favorite movies, the ones I can come back to over and over again, are comedies, so I have a lot of favorites in this genre. But I've got to give the honor to my all-time favorite movie, Shaun of the Dead. As with so many of the other movies on this list, Shaun of the Dead is a blend of different genres and is one of the most well-balanced multi-genre films I know. It's a comedy, it's a horror movie, it's a romance film, and it does each of those things well without sacrificing anything. It's funny, because it's a comedy, but it's also somewhat scary and kind of gory at times, because it's a zombie movie, and then it has this sweetness and charm to it because of the romance part. I mean, it's the ultimate rom-com, and it's just my movie, you know? Ever since I first saw it in theaters, it's been my number one. It's that one movie that makes me laugh, connects with me, entertains me, makes me feel better no matter what. It's just my kind of movie. Adventure. So this is a genre that's kind of interesting within this list, because it's one that you really don't often see as the sole genre of a movie. We've talked about a lot of overlap so far, but pretty much all of the other genres in this list do have quite a few films that could be considered pure for the genre. And I'm sure you could come up with a handful of movies that are just adventure films, but when we're talking adventure, we're usually talking action adventure or sci-fi adventure or fantasy adventure. And so my pick is quite the blend. Part sci-fi, part comedy, part action, all adventure, Back to the Future. That's right, an adventure through time. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record by saying that this is one of my favorite movies, but it's true, and I guess that's an obvious consequence of doing a list like this where I pick my favorite film from each genre. But I get such an immense amount of enjoyment out of this movie. It has a wonderful premise, it's got a set of very memorable and entertaining characters, it's so funny and quotable, and for me, it's one of those ultimate feel-good movies. It's just this exciting time adventure that I'm completely incapable of resisting. If this movie or either of its sequels are ever on TV, I'm sitting down and watching them, and whatever plans I originally had are no more. Comic book. Following up adventure, we've got another genre here that's basically always also something else. Comic book movie is more of a type of story rather than a genre in and of itself, but we'll go with it. So obviously comic book movies have a ton of overlap with action, adventure, often comedy and sci-fi and drama, and even occasionally other genres like thriller or horror. There are certainly a lot of comic book movies that I really enjoy, but this is one that's an easy choice for me. The Dark Knight. So I have to imagine that this isn't a particularly surprising answer, and I'm sure that it's probably in the number one spot of this category for most people. It might be the common answer, but you know what? There's a reason for that. This is a very good movie. It's an excellent Batman film, it's an action movie, it's a crime thriller, it's got some fantastic performances, especially Heath Ledger as the Joker, and it's also such a good looking film too, with some wonderful cinematography. Inception might be my favorite Christopher Nolan movie, but this is a very close second. Horror. So this is one of my favorite genres, and it's one that's so varied. Obviously, that can come from combinations with other genres, like horror comedy, for example, but even within just horror, there are so many different types of stories. There are slashers, haunted house films, supernatural horror, creature features, and tons of other subgenres. And so there are a ton of horror movies that I love, making this a very difficult category to pick my favorite. For me, I have two quintessential horror films, and so choosing between them is so hard, but I think I have to go with Psycho. This Alfred Hitchcock classic really needs no explanation. It's an absolutely masterful film. The cinematography, the lighting, the score, the suspense-driven story and unexpected twists, and I have a connection to this movie that goes beyond just enjoyment of the film itself. This is the movie that made me aware of filmmaking when I was a little kid. I knew that movies weren't real, but before this film, I never really thought about the fact that somebody made them, that somebody created these films. But when I was 6 years old, we went to Universal Studios, and at the time, they had this Alfred Hitchcock attraction. I didn't know anything about him or his movies at the time, but this attraction fascinated me, especially the portion on Psycho. And so this movie had a huge impact on me before I ever even watched it. Western. Of all of the genres that I'm talking about here today, this is probably the one that I watch least often. But despite that, I still do enjoy this genre quite a bit. And it's another one that, perhaps surprisingly, has a good deal of variation. You've got the classic Hollywood westerns with cowboys and stagecoaches, spaghetti westerns, western epics, and a whole slew of contemporary neo-westerns. I could definitely pick a favorite from each of the subgenres, since they're all so different from one another. But if I have to go with just one western, I would pick The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. As a kid, I really wasn't into westerns. I kind of had this skewed view of what they were in my mind, and was just never interested in them, aside from Back to the Future Part 3, of course. I would still watch them occasionally, but it wasn't exactly an enjoyable experience, because I had this negative mindset about them, for no real reason. And I can still remember the first time I watched this movie. I went into it with that negative mindset, and had next to no interest in actually watching the film. But once it got going, that negativity of mine completely disappeared. And honestly, this was the film that changed my overall view on westerns. It wasn't that stereotypical shoot 'em up and ride off into the sunset type of story. It was layered. It was a character study and a mystery and part courtroom drama. And it had the bizarrely satisfying combo of John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. Musical. Okay, so now we're through the original 10 genres and into the bonus 3 that Luke introduced. And we're beginning with arguably my least favorite of the genres. And I say arguably because it depends on how you view and classify musicals. I already mentioned how much I love animated movies, and especially with Disney, that means I technically love an awful lot of musicals. But for me, when I think of this genre, I'm not thinking about animated films. Instead, I'm thinking about live action movies where people suddenly break out into song, or even those musicals where they literally sing every line of dialogue. And to be honest, they're not usually my favorites. There are a handful that I enjoy a decent amount, but really only one that I would say I love: Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. The funny thing is, it wasn't until probably only a few years ago that I accepted the fact that I love this movie. I always liked it, and I couldn't even tell you how many times I've watched it over my lifetime, but for some reason, I always kind of kept it at arm's length. But I've come to realize that it's one of my ultimate feel-good movies. It's such a crazy mixture of fantasy and sarcastic comedy and bizarre darkness. Gene Wilder's performance as Willy Wonka is fantastic, and his is a character that I've grown to like even more as an adult because of the surprisingly sarcastic ambiguity of him. You never quite get a good handle on him and how he actually feels about the situation and these kids, and it just adds this very interesting layer to the story. Then you throw in the memorable songs, the candy factory, and some lickable wallpaper, and you've got a scrumdiddlyumptious movie. Fantasy. Much like Luke, I'm very surprised that this genre wasn't included in the original 10 for this challenge. So many of the biggest, most popular films are at least part fantasy films. That being said, this is one of those genres where I am not a huge fan of just the straight genre film. When you think about sort of the classic fantasy epics, those are the movies I can't stand. Instead, this is a category where the genre crossover is extremely important for me. So my top pick here is certainly a blend, but I would say that fantasy is probably the primary genre, or at the very least, central to the story. Pan's Labyrinth. I adore this film. It was my introduction to Guillermo del Toro, and I can still remember seeing this in the theater for the first time and being equal parts baffled and enthralled. I ended up seeing this another 2 or 3 times at the theater, and probably 100 times since, and it's still such an incredibly compelling film to me. Like many Del Toro movies, it's sort of a dark fairy tale. It's a sinister movie at times, but it's also haunting and beautiful at others, and it's so thematically dense and layered, making it one of those movies that you can interpret in a slightly different way every single time you watch it. The contrast between fantasy and reality is stark in this movie, but still expertly blended to create a single cohesive narrative. Thriller. Oh man, I'm so glad that Luke added this one, because this is one of my absolute favorite genres, which, of course, is gonna make this very, very difficult for me to select a single top film. But really, this is one of those genres that's just always captivated me, ever since I was little. I mean, I know I put Psycho in the horror category, but that's just as much a thriller as it is a horror film. And so thrillers have been essential to my cinematic DNA since the beginning. I've got so many films that are essentially tied for my top spot in this genre, but if I have to pick just one, I'm gonna go with Zodiac. This is such a good movie. It's got some tough competition, but it's definitely my favorite David Fincher film. And it's just one of those movies that's perfectly suited for me. It's tense and suspensefully creepy with its dark, moody atmosphere. It's really interesting because it's sort of this mystery investigation story made all the more compelling by the fact that it's about an actual unsolved real life serial killer. And so it's about this investigation and the Zodiac killings. But it's also about the people trying to solve the mystery of the murders. You've got journalists, you've got detectives, evidence and exposition, and suspects and leads, all building up in such an incredibly engaging way. Alright, so there you have it, my favorite film for each of 13 different genres. What are your favorite movies for these genres? Be sure to post your personal picks in the comments below, and don't forget to check out and subscribe to Luke and the 7 people that I tagged for this challenge. Also, if you're interested in buying any of the movies I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links to all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this tag video, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or at it to see more videos like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.